Thank you, everyone, for joining our live discussion here via Digital Journal's Google Plus page on the rise and the future of citizen media. And we're going to have a pretty lively discussion here discussing what citizen journalism means to our panelists and also what it means to you. You're invited to comment via the Q&A app available if you are viewing this via our Google Plus page. We also have embedded it in our digitaljournal.com news network in case you want to check us out on digitaljournal.com. So what is citizen journalism is going to be one of the key things we talk about, but before we get into any discussion, some introductions I think are in order for those who are unaware of the backgrounds of our panelists. Myself, my name is David Silverberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of digitaljournal.com, an online news network featuring content from contributors from more than 120 countries around the world. We do harness the power of user-generated content and citizen journalism mixed in with content from professional journalists as well. And I'll be the host for today, and I'll be introducing the panelists coming up right now. So, Ira Basen, give us a bit of a sense of who you are and what you do. Ira, can you hear us? All right, let's start with Mathew for now. Mathew.
Okay, I'm Mathew Ingram. I'm a senior writer at GigaOM, and I write a lot about media and sort of the evolution of media.
Great. And Tim.
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at the University of King's College in Halifax, and have an interest in social media and journalism and mobile devices. I'm teaching a course right now on social media and journalism to our master's program students.
Great. And at King's, for those who do not know, are there specific courses on citizen journalism or citizen media, or is it part of the curriculum in some way?
Yeah, I mean, there's no specific course on it, but we touch on it, and pretty much from first year all the way up to fourth year.
Okay, great. So I remember that, and Ira will join us shortly. For those who are unaware, Ira Basen is a CBC journalist, so working in journalism for more than 20 years, and he's also written about citizen journalism in publications such as Mazenot. So Mathew, would you, in conversations we've had before, you've had an issue with the word citizen journalism or citizen media, and why is that? What is it about the moniker that you feel is troubling?
Well, it just feels I don't know. It's the term citizen, I guess. Most people don't think of themselves as citizens. They probably just think of themselves as people. It feels a little like a term that an academic came up with to apply to this phenomenon. So the only problem is there aren't really any good terms. I mean, user-generated content is a horrible, horrible term. They're just all sort of ugly, and so I keep trying to think of. I mean, amateur journalism to me is one way of describing it, as opposed to professional journalism. But it doesn't feel like it feels a little like we're stuck with citizen journalism now.
Is there a word or a phrase that you prefer that it be called?
Well, I do like amateur journalism. I do like networked journalism. It's one of those things that's hard to describe. So, and I guess we're already stuck with lots of other ugly terms like blog, for example, or tweet. So I guess maybe we'll just have to get used to it.
Sure. Ira Basen's joined us. Hi, Ira. How are you?
Sorry, we lost our connection. Hopefully, it won't happen again.
So, just for our audience, can you just introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Well, I'm a very mainstream guy. I've been at CBC Radio for over 30 years. Right now, I primarily for CBC. I primarily do documentaries for the Sunday edition. I just did one for Ideas, and for the last several years, I've really been looking at the impact on technology in a variety of areas, but several things that I've done have been the impact of technology on journalism.
Great. So now a broad overview question for those who wish to have their insight shared here. How has citizen media affected the content that mainstream publishers produce and how readers consume the news today? What do you think are the key identifying impacts that citizen media has had on traditional media?
Well, one of the things is, if you think of any breaking news situation, almost all of the iconic images are from citizen media. One of the big events that happened out east is that the RCMP, the Mountie slayings, about a month ago. And the odd thing that jumped out at me actually was that the main photo that got transmitted around the world was actually from a Times Telegraph journalist, and that so rarely happens. It wasn't the first one, of course, but you don't often get that these days. Almost every image coming from a breaking news situation is captured by someone on the spot, and that's the image that you tend to remember.
Right. Mathew, do you want to offer your insight?
Yeah, I think Tim makes a good point. We're so used to it now, but when you think about it, it's quite incredible the sort of transformation that we've seen, even just over the last 5-10 years, in terms of what you get when something happens. And I know there was an old Dave Barry column about journalism in which he described how journalists are very rarely at the scene of a news event unless it occurs in a newsroom. They're always sort of rushing to the scene after the fact because they've heard about it or seen it on the wire. Well, now we have, literally hundreds, even thousands of citizen journalists, or whatever you want to call it, eyewitnesses who have camera phones and who can take video and can upload things and post their comments. And so you can literally get a flood of reports from a scene right after something happens. And so one of the issues, for me at least, and I'm sure Tim talks about this too, is you almost have too much information now. So in the past, you had too little. Now we almost have too much, and you can't tell what's real and what's not real, and that's an issue I think that not just news consumers, but journalists and journalism is struggling with.
And Ira, do you agree with Mathew that we're inundated with information that's now become the latest problem for consumers and also producers of news?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to get back to what Mathew and Tim were saying, I think the pivotal kind of moment in some ways was in 2009 during the Iranian protests over the election there, and the young woman was killed by Iranian security forces, and of course the Iranians said that the government said that's not what would happen, but there in fact was somebody had taken the cell phone video of her being shot, and I remember I interviewed the person who at the time was like on duty at CBC News World that night when that video came in, and there was no way of verifying who this woman was or where the video came from. And he said, we spent a lot of time thinking about that because we knew that this was a pivotal moment, that this was that were we going to run this video or not without the level of authentication that we would normally demand. And they discussed it for a long time and realized that they had reached some kind of, watershed here about the use of these unverified videos. And they decided that night actually not to do it because they weren't comfortable about it. Now, we see it every day on the news, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Iraq, everywhere. And it's made such an enormous difference in terms of people around the world being able to find out what is happening in these regimes where traditional journalism is not allowed to be done. So I think that was that incident in Iran was really a very pivotal moment. But I think Matthew's absolutely right that people are now inundated with stuff from the web. They realize that most of the stuff that they read is crap and that very hard to verify. And I think what people are looking for, and I think this probably is good from the point of view of traditional media, is that they are looking for credible, reliable, trustworthy sources now because there's so much they need some kind of filter. They're looking for some kind of filter, I think.
So then that brings up the point of what differentiates low-quality, inaccurate citizen journalism from high-quality, credible citizen journalism? What's a way for the average reader who might not have a deep background in journalism practices to differentiate between the two and identify what is credible citizen journalism and what they should maybe be skeptical about for any one of our panelists?
You know, I think the number one thing, other than, you know, someone that you've followed and you've sort of developed a trust relationship with, if it's someone brand new that you're following about some event, I think that the number one thing you can do to prove that you're trustworthy is to show your sources or to show where you got that information. So I look for it. To take one example, Brown Moses, the British blogger Elliot Higgins, constantly mentions where he got the YouTube video, who posted it, when they posted it. When he's using information from social media, he says where it came from, what that person said, whether he has checked it or not. I mean, you have to effectively show your work. And I think that's important, not just for citizen journalists, but for all journalists. That's how you develop trust with your readers. Trust sort of no longer goes along with the brand name of the publication you're associated with or whatever. You have to earn it every time you report something. And so whether you're a citizen journalist or a regular kind, you have to be much more open about where your information is coming from, links to your sources, that type of thing, I think is really important.
And I'd also say you show your trust through your social networks. You know, we trust our friends, we trust the people we follow, and we trust the information that comes from them. So, you know, when you have someone new showing up and there's no legacy or no history in their content that they've produced, you know, that's certainly an element of trust as well. So, you know, Mathew's obviously very good at this, right? He's got his got a huge network of people who are, you know, respected opinions.
But it's not just, you know, regular, ordinary people who need to be able to filter what's true and what's not true from, you know, citizen journalists, because, like, journalists have to do this every day as well. You know, traditional journalists, whatever you want to call them. And it's difficult because, you know, it is true that today everybody can be their own editor and they can be their own reporter and they can be their own fact checker and you know, all of that. But it's hard. It requires, you know, certain skills, and also most people don't have the time or the skills or the inclination to do that. But you know, when videos come in from Syria to a newsroom, it's very hard to, you know, a lot of these people, they don't have social networks. We don't know who they are. It's very difficult to make those decisions. And I do think, as I said before, that the bar has really moved over the last several years, where there's much more of an inclination now to accept it and take the possible consequences of it not being accurate than there was before. And overall, you know, I think that's a really good thing.
I'm always reminded of the example, and I know he's not a citizen journalist per se, but Andy Carvin, formerly of NPR, and now I believe he's with First Look Media. He was on Twitter verifying a lot of what was coming out of the Middle East, basically as something that he independently felt was very important for him to do. So he would study a lot of the citizen journalism feeds and tweets and photos coming in and really analyze and make sure that what was coming in was credible. And I know, Mathew, you yourself were quite a fan of Andy's work. Did you find that he is kind of an exemplar of what to follow in terms of verifying info, or what he was doing maybe not too realistic to do at scale?
Well, I think so. All of those things. I mean, I definitely think that Andy, you know, when he was doing that, it was a brand new thing. So he, to me, was a kind of shining example of what is possible for a single person to do. Admittedly, a person who rarely slept during that period, you know, and probably sacrificed a huge amount of his personal life. But the practice that he was engaged in, I think, is something that really shows what either a citizen journalist or a traditional journalist can do, which is to curate in real time a live stream of content coming from a place and to verify that content in real time. Because I think that's one of the things that it caused a certain amount of controversy, but I think it was also really valuable. He would post things and say, I don't know whether this is true. I don't know whether this is from who it claims to be from or what is of what it claims to be of. Can you help me? And so he would reach out. He talked about his Twitter stream and followers being like a newsroom, a live newsroom. And so he would throw it out to his newsroom and say, are you there? Do you know someone who's there? Can you help me verify this? Can you tell me? And he was doing effectively what Storyful and services like that have sort of institutionalized, which is real-time verification of social media, looking at where the photo is. Do the shadows line up with the time of day when that photo was supposedly taken? Can you look at Google Earth and find that, something in the background to confirm that that's what it was? That type of stuff was, it just had never really been done before. And so I think, to me, that showed the, both the benefits and the disadvantages. And one of the disadvantages was, the guy was never slept and was trying to follow thousands and thousands of people single-handedly. And also his stream, I used to say that I wanted other people to curate Andy's stream in the same way he was curating other people's streams, because there was just so much volume. It really cried out for someone to kind of package it and say, here's all the interesting stuff that came through Andy Carvin's stream. Like, it was almost impossible to watch in real time.
Right.
I couldn't follow him. It was too much.
Yeah.
And do you think that is scalable for an organization to implement? So let's say if BBC wanted to really go really deeper with their citizen journalism efforts, could they get 20 Andy Carvins who would be able to verify the info coming out of Syria, coming out of Iran, coming out of the Middle East in an effective way?
I think they could. And in fact, I think a number of organizations are thinking about doing that. There's Brown Moses, for example, has been talking to a number of media organizations about trying to institutionalize what he does, which is very similar to what Andy did, except his sort of medium is YouTube. A lot of it is verifying weapons that terrorist groups and militant groups have posted on YouTube. It's difficult for a single individual to do all that, but if you have a team, the BBC already has a user-generated content hub. If you just sort of instituted practice standards and sort of people on how to do that, I think definitely do it.
Great. Ira, I have a question for you. I researched some articles about citizen journalism, and I found this one on the Ryerson Review that you were quoted. If you can see my screen over there, it's from a few years ago about citizen journalism. But you were quoted as saying, the ability of people who were previously denied a voice in the mainstream to now have their voices heard is undeniably a cause for celebration. But you also point out there's a definite downside. When everyone is a journalist, no one is a journalist. That was a few years ago, admittedly. So, Ira, do you still agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think specifically what I was referring to here was the what happened in the G20, where are you hearing me, or I'm hearing a huge echo? I mean, are you okay with my audio?
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay. So what happened during the G20 when the the Toronto Police, the RCMP, whomever decided that in fact you had an accreditation, or whether you were just somebody, or everybody was going to be treated, which meant that they had no anybody who claimed that they were journalists. So you had people from CTV being roughed up and arrested. The same way you had bloggers. And what's now, you see this all the time. There's never been a more time journalists. Right? There are more journalists killed last than ever before. There's more journalists incarcerated at the moment than ever before. And these would be people who work for mainstream, and who are independent journalists, people, Vice, whomever. And so there used to be a level of protection for journalists. If you the level of protection, and you're wearing a press jacket was considered to be give you some measure of safety. That's no longer the case. And so that is I think that's a different kind of warfare that we're involved in now. But it's also that everybody now get regimes like repressive regimes like in Syria and wherever, and they don't actually care whether you have an accreditation or not.
And how do you think, since you were quoted in that Ryerson Review article, how do you think citizen journalism has changed in Canada? And just looking at Canada right now, since you've been working in Canadian journalism for over 30 years, have you seen whether our mother core outlet, CBC, embrace it more wholeheartedly, or just coast to coast, Canadian media outlets view it almost as favorably as we've seen in countries such as Asia or some parts of the Middle East?
Well, when I started looking at this in I think it was 2009 or 2008, there were several experiments going on, and one of the most interesting was Now Public. Now Public, which was based in Vancouver, had raised millions of dollars in capital for a citizen journalism site. There was another one in Vancouver called Orato, which is where I speak, that was going to, that they had a lot of promise, and of course what you're doing at Digital Journal, which is a different kind of model, but Orato and Now Public don't exist anymore because it turned out that there wasn't that much of an interest for a standalone citizen journalism site. Readers weren't interested, advertisers weren't interested. At the CBC, this is something that we've been struggling with. I guess it was like in 2010 or something, I developed a workshop on user-generated content for CBC journalists to try and figure out, like, sort of how to navigate this, what we were going to, how we were going to incorporate user-generated content, citizen, input, and how that was going to fit into not just our standards and practices, but also our brand. And this is what's kind of really interesting when you see mainstream media organizations try and incorporate citizen journalism. The most interesting being CNN iReport, which is a standalone citizen journalism site. And we can talk about that later, but it's a tough it's a tough one because CNN's brand is the most trusted name in news, right? That's what for 25 years, this is what they've called themselves, most trusted name in news. It's hard to be the most trusted name in news when you have a site where you can post just about anything and try to marry those two things. So that was a real risk I think the CNN has taken, and sometimes it's worked for them and sometimes it hasn't.
Do you think in general that these experiments with mainstream outlets using an iReport type of technology, has that paid off, you think, in both brand visibility or in propelling citizen journalism to a new kind of level?
Well, as far as I know, no other mainstream outlet has sort of gone down that route where they would have a standalone citizen journalism site. Has it paid off for CNN? Probably overall it has, because it's been, they do it for two reasons. One is it gives them a really kind of valuable stream of content, and the second reason is that it increases, engagement with their audience, and both of those things are good. And they have, when they see something on iReport that they want to put on their main network, they use the kind of verification standards that they use for other content. So I think overall it's worked for them, but it's interesting that nobody else has gone down that road.
Matthew, do you have an assessment of how CNN has approached iReport as either beneficial to the brand or to journalism in general, or do you think it's a failed experiment?
I think it's an interesting experiment. I don't know that we can say that it's failed. It hasn't really, maybe it hasn't had as much impact as they might have hoped for. But I think it's interesting that when it first started, there were a couple of early reports, one about Steve Jobs, for example, having a heart attack, that drew a lot of negative attention because they were clearly someone trying to, post a fake report or hoax the network, and in a couple of cases that had an effect. But we hardly ever hear about that anymore. I mean, I haven't heard about one of those in a long time. To some extent, that means it's working. People are posting things, and either no one is paying any attention, or the process is working. So I don't know whether it's had the effect that CNN was hoping for in terms of the impact on the network, but I think it is interesting that it hasn't kind of exploded as a massive failure either. So it's clearly functioning in some way.
Tim?
Yeah, they had that one brief point where they came into the news with the Virginia Tech. They had this blurry video and some shots in the background, and for that, for that event, that was really the piece of video that was broadcast around. But you haven't really heard much since then, and it seems to me, in this day, in 2014, it seems rather odd to ghettoize user content and put a special label on it, and put it in a separate section of the site. I mean, it's source material, right? And the idea of sort of treating it as a special way, instead of just their usual journalistic processes of verification. That seems odd today.
Right. And that is coming up more and more. We've seen that with BBC and also with Huffington Post when they did Off the Bus, is that a lot of citizen journalism sections were kind of very separated from the mainstream outlet. I believe NBC and Newsvine did something similar. Do you think that's a wise move to make, because some outlets considered citizen journalism to be an important label separated from the professional journalism, quote unquote, that was happening from their paid staffers? Because also citizen journalism was often not remunerated the same way as professional journalism was for those outlets. Do you think it's a wise move for it to be ghettoized, or do you think it's smarter for it to be mixed in with all the other professional journalism that a news outlet will produce?
Well, I think Tim is right, and this is what I was saying before. I think it's become much more integrated than it used to be, and so as Tim was saying, it seems odd to kind of differentiate it that way. And I think the reason why you're not seeing it much anymore is because it's now become that kind of content has become much more in the mainstream. And as I was saying before, people are the mainstream now is much more comfortable by saying flashing the super saying unverified video. And going with that, and that's now considered to be enough, whereas a few years ago that wasn't enough just to say that it was unverified video. So I think that's why one of the reasons why we don't hear that much anymore about iReport and why other people haven't gone down that road, because it's become much more integrated into the mainstream.
Matthew?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I think when a lot of these things started, news organizations were afraid, effectively, of this new thing, and so they wanted to keep it kind of in a sandbox, or kind of put up a force field around it and say, this thing, we haven't checked it, we're not sure about it, it's from unknown sources, so our sort of real journalism is over here, and then there's this other thing. And I think what you're seeing a lot more is all of that content just gets integrated into whatever the media entity is doing. They're embedding tweets, they're posting videos. I mean, lots of the news reports that I see consist of, I did a Google search and I found these videos on whatever site, and here are some tweets that I found that used the same hashtag. That's sort of a shortcut now to doing a news report. But it's basically infiltrated the news process. And then one of the things that I think we were going to talk about was how that process happens, how that content gets verified if it does, and how it gets credited. So a lot of organizations choose to just put, oh, we found these videos on YouTube, or we found these tweets, and they don't really give you a kind of, much information on where it came from exactly.
Yeah, let's definitely touch upon that very soon. And after Tim, do you want to add your input onto that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was that Tow Center report a couple of weeks ago that looked at how news organizations are using amateur footage and user-generated content, and there were two aspects to it. On one hand, you get some of the larger news organizations really starting to pay attention, bringing together staff and devoting resources to user verification. And then on the other hand, they said there's an awful lot of newsrooms that really don't know what to do with it. They're still labeling this amateur footage, instead of actually crediting an actual person or at least a username, but simply, and in many cases the editors are getting it from an agency of some sort and simply don't know where it came from, and in some cases aren't even aware that they're using user-generated content.
Right, and just to fill people in on what that is, I'll show you quickly the article that Mathew wrote about it. So Mathew, do you want to kind of sum up your assessment of the Tow Center report and what you thought about its findings and how it might impact mainstream outlets right now?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the main takeaway is in the headline. Lots of mainstream media outlets are happy to use citizen journalism, but they very rarely say who actually uploaded it, who created it. They give hardly any credit at all. Mark Little at Storyful likes to say that the typical credit is via YouTube or via Facebook or Twitter, which is a little like putting on a regular news report via the telephone. It doesn't really tell you anything about where that information came from, and it certainly doesn't give any credit to the original uploader. And so one of the things that I know Storyful has been really focused on is getting credit and in some cases payment for those quote-unquote citizen journalists who upload the video that everybody is embedding or who post the photo that everybody's embedding.
I have to say, sorry.
Go ahead, Ira.
When I read Mathew's article, what struck me was that this is a problem that kind of predates citizen journalism because if you look at the work that the Center for Media and Democracy has done over the years, one of their big beefs is TV news programs that take footage that comes from B-roll or VNRs that come from public relations organizations, and they don't identify the source of it. They'll either say file footage or they won't say anything about where it is, and it's really important whether the content comes from a PR firm, whether the content comes from a citizen journalist to identify the source of it. And so that problem of sourcing is not just the problem that relates to content that comes from citizen journalists. It's a problem that relates to content that comes from everywhere that TV news seems to be very reluctant to identify.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that jumped out at me about the report is that it portrayed news organizations and editors as being still kind of takers of social media. The breaking news event happens, and editors go onto Twitter and simply either grab an image or ask permission, but that's the end of it, right? And what came out of that report is they said one of the conclusions, the recommendations, is that editors become much more involved in showing people how their content was used and explaining how they were going to use it in subsequent news coverage. And it's much more of an idea of a reciprocal relationship between editors and the people they get the content from, which I think some of the bigger news outlets are doing, but many of the smaller outlets aren't.
Right. Actually, my next question is for you, Tim. You come from a journalism school in Halifax, Canada, and so I'm curious how intensive are citizen journalism courses or curriculum at your journalism school, or perhaps at other J schools that you may have experience with, and should it be part of the regular curriculum for journalists to learn about, maybe not to practice, since they're trained to be professional journalists, quote unquote, but what role does citizen journalism have as an educational tool for people who want to be, well, I guess full-time staff journalists, or perhaps they want to start their own news startups?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about citizen media an awful lot, and the mantra today at universities is turn outwards, right? The quote-unquote ivory tower, is under attack. The isolation, the inward focus. So you see a lot of journalism schools much more of a community focus in their publications, and not just having students spit content out, but try to involve people more, whether it's through live chats or live events or getting people to submit content, encouraging people to submit content. You're seeing an awful lot more of that, I think, at journalism schools in trying to go get a community, get an audience, and try to involve them in the students' content anyway.
Great. We actually have a question from our audience. This is coming from a user named Dean Currie, and so he asked, Mathew, you made a good point about how a journalist like Andy Carvin can use a social network and citizen journalists to work as part of a process. Is that a model that appeals to you? So, yeah, if you can just reiterate that, is that an appealing process for you, Mathew?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. To me, the best thing about that process is it is completely transparent, which is also what I like about Brown Moses. So much of what we consider journalism, mainstream traditional journalism, happens behind the scenes in newsrooms, in private conversations between journalists and editors, between journalists and other journalists. There's all this sort of sausage making that happens in newsrooms, and it, in many cases that has an impact on the way you look at a story. But most readers have no clue that a lot of that is happening. What the best part about watching that sausage being made, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or blogs or wherever, is that you get some insight into how stories are shaped, how certain facts are chosen over others, how things are verified or not verified, and then you as the reader can make a decision about what you choose to believe or not believe. And I think that's the hard part about that process is, A, it's really hard, and B, it's really chaotic. So my analogy is the process that used to happen in newsrooms where journalists used to get information coming in real time from the news wires and so on, that was only ever available to media entities. Now we see that happening all the time. The news wire is Twitter and Facebook and every other form, Instagram and Snapchat. So all of that information is coming at us, all the time in the open, and we journalists and citizen journalists have to filter it, verify it, make sense of it, figure it out. That process is now happening in front of everyone instead of just in newsrooms. And I think fundamentally that's a good thing. Sometimes it looks like a bad thing because it is so chaotic and because there is misinformation and so on. The Boston bombing is a great example. But fundamentally, in the long term, I think it is beneficial.
Right. Are there certain regions of the world, and this is open to the entire panel, are there certain regions of the world that you feel best harness citizen journalism, and are kind of what other regions of the world should look up to, or other news outlets should look up to as a guiding light for how to practice credible and high-quality citizen journalism?
I think anywhere, in the Middle East. I mean, you look at what's happened. The big change that's happened really over the last several years is you take a look at what's happening in Syria. Assad has been very effective in basically shutting out traditional media. There are very, very few reporters that are in there, and historically what would have happened is that would have been basically the end of the story. But what was happening in Syria, we would occasionally be able to get some scattered reports that would come out of there, but the ability to basically shut down news coverage was within the realm of the possible for people like him, and now it's not. We can get a continuous stream of videos and news reports, and that's made an enormous difference in our ability to unfortunately it hasn't made that much of a difference, I suppose, in the sense that people are still getting killed, but at least it's not. At least there are people who can bear witness, and the world can know what's happening, and then they can decide to do something or not to do something. But I think that's fundamentally changed the equation, where it used to be that all a government had to do was deny visas or confine reporters to their hotel rooms and that kind of thing, and that was basically the end of the story. And now it's not, and that's a huge development.
That is a pretty huge development. I would agree. It's the best part about having citizen journalists in places where traditional journalists can't go is that you can get information that you would never have had access to before. And yes, some of it may be flawed, and yes, some of it may be biased, and you may have to do more filtering, but at least you're getting that information. One of my favorite examples is Ukraine, Turkey, places where the government has effectively cracked down on traditional journalism, and or in some cases traditional media entities have failed to do their jobs because those companies are in bed with the government or because they're concerned about possible backlash. You see groups like at 140 Journos in Turkey doing what amounts to real-time journalism. Half of them aren't even journalists and don't even consider themselves journalists, but they're effectively doing better journalism than traditional media outlets are. That's a really, really powerful thing.
And would you consider better journalism being deeper access into the story? What do you count as better journalism, since that is such a subjective term?
Well, just in their case, it's digging, verifying, revealing facts that certain parties don't want revealed. 140 journals spent a lot of time doing real-time verification of voting patterns during the election, because a lot of the reporting, traditional reporting and government reporting about those statistics was flawed and or PR. So that's a fundamental, journalistic function to test those things and check those things and say whether they're true or not. Traditional media was not doing that.
Right. Tim, do you want anything to add on certain parts of the world that you feel are propelling citizen journalism?
There's an interesting project in Australia called the Conversation, which involves academics. Actually, they're pairing up news editors with professors of various universities in order to get them to comment on news events. So, if you go to the website, you see this week they have academics talking about all the data that FIFA is accumulating, the player data, and how the time of possession and how far these players are traveling, and what it means for interpretation of the game. Can you calculate that the person who has possession the longest is most likely to win the game, that type of thing. And you can't argue that profs are citizens necessarily in the typical way that we would think of the average Joe, but for most academics they aren't very good writers for the public, and that's one of the reasons they're pairing them up with editors, is to get them to write in plain language. And it speaks to this need for trusted sources that it seems to be working very well in Australia and has a fairly big market. Getting other people involved anyway in the news process that aren't just reporters. Right.
I want to also highlight the region of Africa, which is really intriguing to look at because of a startup called Omidyar, and I'll just quickly show you a screenshot of an interview with one of the founders of Omidyar from The Guardian recently. And so one of the key takeaways I took from that article was how new technologies are powering citizen journalism in Africa in ways they never would have thought were possible before. One of the key things being mobile, and one of the key things within mobile being the app called WhatsApp. And so I'm curious whether you have seen in your experience, either talking to startups or talking to citizen journalism groups and networks, whether new technologies are changing the way that they're reporting the news and changing the way that, let's say, people from Africa are reading the news, or people from America are reading the news about Africa based on the new technologies that are enabling deeper access into these community-oriented stories.
I think that's definitely happening. I think that it's fascinating to look at what some news organizations, including the BBC, are doing with new apps like WhatsApp, trying to reach a different audience, trying to expand sort of their grasp when it comes to different forms of journalism. I wrote about people using Whisper, the anonymous sharing app. It's been fascinating to see, for example, Nietzsche Zimmerman, who went to Whisper from Gawker, was saying that use of Whisper dramatically increased in Iraq after the Iraqi government cracked down on traditional networks like Facebook and Twitter. So I think that what you see is all of these apps provide a sort of outlet for people to share whatever it is they want to share. In some cases, that's going to be gossip or photos, but in some cases it's actually going to be useful information, something approaching what we call journalism. So it's not, and where governments try to shut down one network, another network emerges. You see, it's like water, finding the best possible route. And I think it is interesting to think about how you can use those apps and those services in different ways to reach people who you may not otherwise have reached. For me, at least, the mobile sort of revolution has changed things dramatically. I know in Africa, Ushahidi was an early network platform trying to use mobile, and particularly text messaging, as a way of getting information about elections, for example, in Kenya. That kind of phenomenon, whether it's ushahidi or something else, is very, very powerful. In a lot of countries, the only computer you have is a phone, and you may not have access to LTE, or you may not have the fanciest iPhone, but you do have a portable, information device that you can text or take a photo and send it. That's a really incredibly powerful force.
Definitely. Tim or Ira, have you got any insight into how new technologies are affecting citizen journalism?
It's not really my area, so I think I'll take a pass on that one.
Sure. Tim?
Well, only to repeat what Mathew said, is that in North America we tend to think that involves smartphones and the latest technology, but in many developing countries it's much simpler phones, and they're finding new ways and to send content that aren't necessarily what we use here.
Right. So we have another question from our audience, and this is actually from a digital journalist named Christopher Shabo. He wrote, "Do you like how National Geographic does Your Shot, where subscribers enter photos that they took? They are remunerated as well as named in the magazine and online. Is this perhaps the way to go for user-generated content, possibly for photos along with video?" Anyone familiar with what National Geographic is doing?
I'm not familiar with that, but it is quite common in a bunch of different outlets that they will do a sort of reader submissions. Send us your photos. We used to do that, in fact, at the Globe and Mail when there was a weather event or something. We would ask people for their submissions and then have a photo gallery, for example, with links to photo credits for each one. I think it's a really simple way of engaging with your audience. Everyone loves to take photos of, either themselves or the hurricane or the flood or the fire. It's a really simple way to kind of to give recognition back to your readers by saying, thanks for your submission, and here it is, and here's your name, and I mean, everyone loves to see their name in print.
Right.
I think,
yeah, go ahead, Ira.
I guess the sort of downside of that, the sad part, is that National Geographic, has historically been the home of the world's greatest photographers. I mean, that is what that magazine's popularity was based on, was extraordinary photographs. And same thing, the Chicago Sun-Times, about a year ago fired their entire photography staff, and said that from now on our photographs will come from reporters who are on the scene or from readers. Again, the idea being that any idiot can now take a picture, and one would, I think actually the Sun-Times might have hired some of them back since then, but one hopes that the idea of professionalism, the idea of expertise, the idea that there are certain things about that a photographer can bring, an experienced photographer can bring to a shoot that a citizen with an iPhone just can't do. So it's a kind of a deprofessionalization of photography, and I think in the end that would be kind of sad.
Do you agree, Tim, that sometimes the amateurization of some journalism can hurt how either the brand is regarded or even the livelihood of some long-time professional journalists?
I guess it depends on what your brand is. I mean, to me, it's more about involving your readership in what you do. So if you're just talking outward and yapping and not making any efforts at listening to what people are saying and trying to involve them and opening up the process of news, then that can be a problem. But absolutely have to be careful with citizen media, amateur content. Absolutely, we talked about that extensively.
I was going to say, I hear a lot from traditional journalists whenever I write about citizen journalism, and the tone is often, how can you support this sort of thing because it's putting real journalists out of work. And you could make the same claim about photographers or videographers. The sort of unspoken, or in some cases spoken, argument is, well, lots of outlets are just going to use the free stuff, and so then they won't pay for the real stuff, the stuff that I make my living at or whatever. And I think that I mean, fundamentally that part is partly true. The economics of the business that we call journalism, the economics of media and content, those videos, text, have changed, and so you can get a lot more for very little, and that is not, we can't unmake that omelet. I mean, it has happened, so that is going to have an effect on our business. But to me, the benefits that we get as both as journalists and as just sort of members of society from all that user-generated content far outweigh the concerns about sort of one person's job or another person's job. I think if you fundamentally believe that journalism, whether visual or textual, is of value, then you have to believe that what we have now is fundamentally better. It may be more messy and it may be more chaotic. People may be losing their jobs. Other people are getting jobs. But fundamentally, overall, I think it is beneficial.
And I wasn't making the economic argument, although I am prepared to do that. My point was that if National Geographic is, if National Geographic becomes a place for amateur photographers, as opposed to the kinds of people, the sort of world's best photographers that they have attracted in the past, that's a loss, a net loss for I suppose for society, right? Because in the same way that we always want people to, we want to see the best that the world has to offer, and it's true that these guys would lose their job and stuff, but that's actually not the case that I was making, at that time.
But my point would be, if I love National Geographic, but if those photographers can reach their audience directly, that might actually be better for them than going through National Geographic. And if there is a marketplace or an audience for great photography, it will continue to exist and grow. And in fact, it may actually be better off now than when everything was filtered through one magazine.
Yeah, but who's going to pay those photographers to go to the jungles of Africa to take those photographs? I mean, that's, I think, what the issue is. And I mean, you're right in an abstract sense, that it is better than if it was just filtered through one magazine. But on a practical level, I wonder how that's going to work.
Well, couldn't the same argument be made for traditional text-based journalism, where people might see citizen journalists reporting for BBC News and saying, well, if that isn't the best of the best of journalists, graduating from UK universities or global universities that push out top-notch journalists, is that watering down the BBC brand, to use that example, or is that BBC looking beyond their kind of routine beats and trying to go into communities that might not be getting coverage, much like these photographers for National Geographic might be covering aspects of the world that National Geographic just doesn't either have a budget for or just have a editorial interest in.
I think to me, the bottom line is you can get some pretty high quality journalism, words, videos, audio, images, for nothing. I mean, that's just a fact. People are willing, for whatever reason, either because they have other jobs or because they just love seeing their stuff reach an audience, they are willing to produce content that is in some cases of high quality for nothing. And so, that's effectively, as a journalist, as a professional journalist, that's your competition. I wrote a whole post about Brown Moses, a guy who started verifying, Syrian weapon videos for free because he happened to be unemployed and because he was interested in the topic, and has quickly become a sort of, world-renowned expert in this topic, to the point where the New York Times is citing his research. Aid groups are going to him for information. That guy was doing for free a better job of that task, that journalistic task, than lots of people who were being paid. So if you're a professional journalist, your job has gotten harder. You have to just be better than the people who are doing it for free, or you have to add something else of value. That's just an economic fact.
Do you agree, Tim and Ira?
There was a great piece in the Boston Globe about a year ago where they, instead of sending a photographer out into the various communities, they wanted to do community profiles, and what they did is they just brought in photos from the various hashtags on Instagram being used around, got people to tell the stories of their own neighborhoods, and that was something that you got a completely different look at those communities, from the inside than you would have from, sending a news photographer to take those photos, I think. But I'm very sympathetic with Ira's point as well, is that it changes the nature of news organizations and the quality of what's there. But I think ultimately people will pay for work, and that's the thing. Most citizen media isn't a lot of work, at least of people snapping photos and putting them on Twitter, putting them on Facebook. They're documenting their own experience. There's obviously a range of that. There's a lot of people, doing good work, based in passion for whatever interest they have. But people will pay for work, and that's what the journalists at the Globe and the Toronto Star, and I think that's why there's a lot of exciting opportunities in data. It's that requires a fairly solid skill to be able to sift through data and put together an investigative project, and that's something that most normal people aren't going to be able to do.
Yeah, the newsrooms are smaller than they've ever been, and the world hasn't shrunk, and so there's lots of places where perhaps people. A news organization would send a reporter to cover where they no longer do, and so there's this huge gap, and that gap is being filled and should be filled by people who are there and who can report on this. Patch was an instructive kind of example where AOL thought that there would be a real market for micro micro sites that in very small communities, and that didn't work out because there was no business model for that, and that's going to be a problem, because ultimately people will work for free for a short period of time, and then they can't do that anymore. And so what you lose then is a set of institutional memory that makes it very difficult. I'll go to City Hall for a few weeks and blog about that. But am I going to do that, every night for several years? No, not if somebody doesn't pay me to do that. And so when you look at, sort of big stories, the Rob Ford story was not going to be done by citizen media, I don't think. It was going to take an organization that had, a lot of resources behind it, that had a lot of lawyers behind it, and I think that's true of all kinds of investigative stories that you can name. There are, if you look at the Rob Ford story, sure there were videos that were taken by citizen journalists, right, that became part of that story. But to carry that story through to its conclusion, I think required an organization of the size and the heft of the Toronto Star or Gawker, although the situation there was somewhat different.
Right. So then, do you see that kind of example as citizen media complementing professional media in a way so that the two are working seamlessly together? E.g., if there's video of Rob Ford that someone captures late night in Toronto, and they're able to add context and depth to it to a Toronto Star journalist, and they work together and collaborate, do you see that as a kind of an ideal partnership where they work together, and should more mainstream outlets pursue this?
Yeah, I do think it's an ideal, and I think the mainstream outlets are doing that. I don't think anybody now, turns people away or turns video away. They won't use all of it, obviously, but they'll consider it in a way that they never would have considered it just a few years ago, and that's a very good thing.
Yeah, I think fundamentally these things work together. Whenever I do talk about citizen journalism or user-generated content, my point is that we're expanding the field of journalism. We're not taking citizen journalists and replacing traditional journalists with them. To me, and in many cases, some traditional media outlets are shrinking. But that's been happening for 30 years. So I mean, TV started that. It wasn't social media. So I think what we're seeing is an expansion of the field of what we call journalism and who practices it, and that's actually good. It may require new skills of traditional journalists. To me, there's much more focus on smart curation, verification, aggregation, as opposed to kind of, we create this story when we report a specific fact. That requires different skills, but it doesn't mean that journalism isn't happening, and it doesn't mean that those things can't all work together.
So then, the final question then would be, what's the future of citizen journalism? We've seen, of course, when we discuss its beginnings from those times in 2009 to even earlier during the Haiti disaster to today. And so, where do you see it going the next decade or so? And Mathew, perhaps you can discuss the startups that you are quite excited about, and Ira and Tim, have you been seeing anything either in Canada or beyond that has given you hope that citizen media will be taking the next step, and what would that next step kind of look like for it to either mature and perhaps for it to develop its own business model?
That's a tough one. I mean, the business model part in particular. But I think we're just going to see more and more citizen journalism emerging and all. It's going to be everything from individuals with Twitter accounts, to loose collectives like to actual startups trying to institutionalize it. Storytel is a great example. And we're going to see much more of that being integrated into media companies, at least the smart ones. So I think there's just a fundamental human interest and impulse in sharing information. So if you are around what's happening, you want to tell people about it, you want to share photos about it, you want to give people your perspective because you're actively involved. That's a fundamentally sort of journalistic impulse, and I don't think that's going away soon. In fact, we have way more tools for doing that than we used to. It's going up all the time. So I think we're going. The explosion has just begun. We're going to keep seeing ripple effect.
Okay, Ira or Tim, do you want to have your say on the outlook on the future of citizen media?
Well, I mean, I agree with Mathew that there's certain inevitabilities here. One is that mainstream media will continue to shrink. The footprint of mainstream media will continue to shrink. People's desire to be involved in that process will continue to grow. The technology will to allow them to have more and more. And so those are just inevitable forces. What's going to happen is that they'll come together because they're made for each other, right? Mainstream media will need journalists increasingly, and media because that will allow them to the platform and allow them to sort of value-added work what they're doing.
Right, and we apologize for the echo to our audience in case you are hearing a bit of an echo, but hopefully with Tim, our final speaker for the final question, will be echo-free. So Tim, you want to give this last question a whirl?
Well, just briefly, I think we'll see a stronger ecosystem between journalists and the people who supply citizen media. One of the things in the Tow report was that they hope that Twitter and Facebook provide more of a mechanism for people to issue rights. In their posting. So is this under the Creative Commons license or whatever? Our news organizations are allowed to use my picture that I took of this car accident. I think we'll see stronger relationships and more sort of protocols so that it doesn't become sort of the awkward thing it still is.
Great. So, any more sentiments to add? I don't want to cut you off in case you did want to share something about citizen media that you weren't able to share in the past hour. Ira, Mathew, or Tim, anything you want to conclude on?
Not that I can think of. Just everybody get out there and do some journalism.
I like that. Ira or Tim?
No, that was a good conversation. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely I did too. So I will say that we will be able to view this entire conversation via Digital Journal's YouTube page. The great thing about Google Plus Hangouts on Air is that you can view the entire conversation in case you did miss it, or in case any of your friends did miss it, on our YouTube page. And just the final thing I will just let you guys know about is that if you want to get in touch with Digital Journal, here's the quick and dirty of how to do so via social and, of course, our main website. And if you need to get a hold of any of the great panelists that we had, we have listed their Twitter handles in a few of the tweets, and we'll do one more kind of big roundup tweet mentioning their Twitter handles so that you can get in touch with them via Twitter in the future. So I want to thank everyone who's been on the panel, Mathew Ingram, Ira Basen, and Tim Currie, for this great discussion on citizen journalism, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon about where it's going to be heading in the next bit or so. So thanks for everyone so far.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Ciao for now.